At long last, someone of Professor Richard Dawkins' stature has risen to champion the truth about God and religion. It is difficult to imagine a man better suited for such a messianic task. Dawkins is noted for being one of the most influential scientists in his field of evolutionary biology and a rare master of articulating arcane scientific jargon in plain English. And in this age of small-screen luminaries, it doesn't hurt that he is also quite a celeb and a showman at heart, the kind of unabashed pulpit bully who would happily lose a Galilean trial for the chance to die a martyr for the scientific cause. For the atheist reader, of course, Dawkins is blasting his way through a wide-open door. Most scientists and enlightened lay people are already acutely aware of the fact that God is no more than a man-made fiction and that religion is a collective delusion. Today, even young children know that there isn't the flimsiest shred of empirical evidence for the existence of a supreme being, angels, heaven and hell, let alone immaculate conception, rising from the dead, or any of the myriad inane fairy tales that cram the holy Bibles. How did one scientist put it? If God really wanted to conceal his very existence, he couldn't have done a better job. So why, if I so readily and wholeheartedly believe that God is a man-made fiction and that religion is a collective delusion, why do I just as firmly maintain that Dawkins is completely and utterly wrong? Dawkins' mistake stems from what I call the primordial sin of philosophical and religious discourse over the ages, and subsequently of the life and human sciences. The lack of clear distinction between the physical reality and the metaphysical reality of life. Dawkins sets out on his crusade in the name of the physical truth about God's existence. And on this matter, he is indeed quite right. Empirically and logically, the God hypothesis fares even worse than the geocentric hypothesis. But the physical truth is not the only truth which is of vital concern to us. There are biological truths and psychological truths that are no less essential. Life and death are meaningless in the physical sense, yet are of crucial significance for biological organisms. Psychological truths, such as the love I feel for my children, are immaterial in the physical sense, yet are of the utmost significance for me as a human being. Life is a metaphysical organization and process superimposed upon the physical and chemical substrata. With the first self-replicating molecules, physics and chemistry gave rise to a novel, metaphysical realm, the biosphere, with its distinctive laws, structures, behaviors, and self-ascribed meaning. I use the word metaphysical here quite differently from the customary denotation in philosophy. The metaphysical realm of the biosphere has nothing to do with spirituality or transcendence per se, nor, as ancient philosophers would have it, with matters that are beyond physics. The metaphysical realm, as I define it, comprises all the emergent structures and behaviors that derive from the teleonomic agenda of living organisms and cannot be reduced to physical and chemical principles. Everything which the biotic evolution gave rise to, from the genetic code to the sentences you are hearing here, carry the duality of the physical, in the given instances, certain nucleic acids and ink blots, and the metaphysical, namely their symbolic value, consequential only within the biosphere. In this sense, muscles and machines are no less metaphysical than subjective sensations or mental constructs. Eons into the biotic evolution on Earth, the development of central nervous systems gave rise to yet another novel realm, the mental sphere. Humans are physical and biological bodies, but they are quintessentially mental, spiritual beings. The symbolic neurochemical representations of the mental realm were from the outset metaphysical fiction whose relation to physical reality was correlative at best. The most primitive constructs of perception, the sensation of objects' concreteness, light and heat, colors, sound, tastes and scents, are all fiction that does not exist in the physical realm. There is a continuous progression in the complexity of the symbolic representations in the brain, from those primitive constructs which, although fictitious, constitute animals' ultimate reality, through the more complex constructs, the sensation of hunger, pain and fear, the experience of orgasm and aesthetics, which exist and hold meaning solely within the biosphere, and ending with the higher order metaphysical constructs, exclusive to the human mind, symphonies, the English language, quantum physics, the mystical experience, and indeed, God. To put it simply, we live a metaphysical fantasy all of our own, a vast and intricate fiction that takes place only in our heads. Physical reality serves mostly as the backdrop to this drama, akin to the physical stage on which our theatrical flights of fancy are played out. All living beings live similar drama. Ours is simply larger in scope thanks to the complexity of our brains. In reality, it's just neural activity, different only in extent, with no further actuality or significance. Our will to live, to be loved, to find meaning, or to be forever remembered is as physically senseless as it is metaphysically of utmost importance to us. Dawkins should uphold this metaphysical edifice with supreme reverence, instead of trying to undermine its foundations. Unlike the empirical and logical criteria which determine the validity of scientific theories, the only validity criterion for biological and mental constructs is evolutionary adaptiveness, their contribution to fitness and reproduction. In the language of the brain and in human cognition, there is no distinction between constructs which are adaptive because they accurately represent physical reality, such as the image of the camera in front of me, and adaptive constructs, which are sheer metaphysical fiction, like the language in which I speak. God is not a valid hypothesis in the physical realm, as A.J. Ayer rightly held, but his existence is perfectly valid in the metaphysical realm, in the hearts and minds of the faithful. For the believer, God's existence is as real as the existence of colors, sounds and scents, of love, grief, beauty and borders between countries, or of any other adaptive fiction. In that sense, God is no more a delusion than the concept of Dawkins himself is. Both are adaptive mental constructs in people's minds that have little to do with the underlying physics. Dawkins upholds the supremacy of physical reality over people's metaphysical reality and misses the heart of the matter. As the flag bearer of evolutionary biology, he should have been the first to realize the close affinity between religion and the biotic evolution. Both trample the truth for survival. For living organisms, fallacious metaphysical truths are just as important as physical truths. That is why in what I call the metaphysical sciences, i.e. evolutionary biology, sociology, psychology, etc., fictitious constructs such as pain, evil, memory, justice, and God are perfectly empirical facts. Scientifically legitimate questions cannot possibly probe God's physical validity, only his adaptive value in human affairs, that is, his metaphysical validity. Accordingly, if, as I maintain, physically fallacious beliefs in God, the Messiah, heaven, afterlife, even in a Swiss cheese moon, enhance people's well-being, their physical and mental salubrity, the quality of their social lives, and at the bottom line, their evolutionary success, then the metaphysical sciences should be leading promoters of physically fallacious beliefs. Contrary to Dawkins' protestations, God is arguably the most successful meme in human history, and belief in God, one of the species' most successful cultural adaptations. Faith provides the believer with a powerful intellectual incentive for survival, however irrational and factually flawed. All other incentives, from the physiological imperatives to existential defiance, pale by comparison. Although nothing is easier than to scientifically refute the power of prayer to affect anything in the physical world, No one has ever managed to land on the moon, bring rain, or heal the dying with a prayer. The vast majority of people in every corner of the world continues to pray daily. There is no other human activity which has been put to the test so many times and has so utterly and consistently failed to yield results, and yet no other human activity is as universally adhered to and is as effective in comforting and uplifting the soul as praying. It doesn't take a genius to see why. With all the wonderful advancements in science, technology, and medicine, we still don't know if we will live to see tomorrow, or if our children will reach adulthood, or make it home safely from school. With so little knowledge and control against so much to lose, what else can one do except kneel and pray? The conviction that killing oneself is an offense against the divine creator enabled countless believers to endure their personal hell on earth without committing suicide. There isn't a single truth in the whole of science, not even keen awareness of the evolutionary dictum, which may dissuade a person from suicide. On the contrary, rational reasoning has often led the hopeless to conclude that life is no longer worth living. Once the sanctity of life is taken out of the equation, there is no logical distinction between life and a cup of coffee that grew cold. One can and better rid oneself of both. Sylvia Plath's poem, Cut, pointedly portrays how her physiological will to live yields to her unwilling apostate mind. Inadvertently cutting her thumb, suicidal Plath watches her blood's million soldiers run, redcoats every one, gush from the wound to defend her against marauding bacteria, and asks chidingly, "Whose side are you on?" Living is not a rationally or factually based decision. It is easy to reach the limit of observation, of reason, of technique. It is much harder to contend with the unrelenting anguish, with the meaninglessness of life, with death and nothingness. Faith arises where the empirical and logical no longer serve us. Its message is absolute and infallible, as it is optimistic and inspirational, conferring grandeur upon the mundane, exalting to the point of ecstasy. Dawkins must have heard of E.G. Hardy's epigram, "The main object of religion is not to get a man into heaven, but to get heaven into him." Anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski referred to the state of mind of a non-believer like himself as tragic and shattering. This sentiment echoes Jean Hamburger's experience as a medical student when a 25-year-old woman dying of cancer gripped his hand and looked him in the eye. This life, that's soon over. Isn't that absurd? What a pity I can't believe in God. No scientific truth could have eased this dying woman's spiritual throes, but faith could have sent her to heaven with a sense of euphoric tranquility rarely enjoyed by the firmest non-believers. Physics will never provide answers to the ultimate why questions that are at the heart of our existential angst. It is the metaphysical sciences, e.g. psychology and sociology, that evidence faith as the ultimate solace for the human predicament. The very fact that there are hundreds of different and mutually incompatible religions and faiths in the world underscores the point. In itself, perhaps the greatest insult to the Dawkinsian position that in the end it doesn't even matter what one believes in as long as one believes in something. In other words, the adaptive value of faith in human affairs is so great that it doesn't even matter what people believe in, even if they believe in utter nonsense. This is true not only for individual fitness, but for group fitness as well. Nothing unites people and galvanizes them into action more than Moses' rallying call. "Whoever is on the Lord's side, let him come unto me." The continuous flow of jihadists who flock from four corners of the earth to join ISIS and who yearned more than anything to become shaheeds provides a 21st century reminder for the abiding power of holy crusades and, indeed, holy anything. Neither king and country nor noble ideals such as democracy and liberty can match the appeal of martyrdom and the chance to die in the name of God. Dawkins surely knows that these acts of ultimate sacrifice have little to do with the elusive deity and everything to do with terms he must feel quite at home with: inclusive fitness, kin selection, reciprocal altruism, that can bring the faithful to a level of unus pro omnibus, rarely seen outside of eusocial hymenoptera. Life is matter and will. Religion must be fundamentally irrational because life's will is fundamentally irrational. No one chooses to be born or walk or talk. We eat and mate and raise children and do whatever we do because of primordial programs and drives that all derive from the irrational imperative, live. It doesn't take superior intelligence, nor evidently modern scientific knowledge, to see through the prosy mechanics of life and realize that vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Or that, as Lawrence Slobodkin quipped, life is just a game in which the winner is allowed to keep playing. Why would any intelligent being care to go on living once it realizes the inherent meaninglessness of it all? Only the irrational will to live and its subjectively gratifying derivatives, from choice food and sex to worshipping the divinity and writing polemic essays, keep people going. Ultimately, it is not the meek who shall inherit the earth, nor survival of the fittest. It's the faithful who shall inherit the earth, what Dawkins might like to call survival of the dumbest. If an extraterrestrial civilization is ever to make contact with us, it will have to not only be technologically advanced, but also deeply religious, or else it would have died off long ago, leaving the stage to more inveterate and unshakable fanatics. No one seems to be out there. Perhaps intelligence is bound to self-destruct once truth and reason overcome the primordial drives and completely deflate its metaphysical bubble. There is a supreme irony in Dawkins' position, for he, who more than any other biologist elucidated the paradoxical role of truth in life, uses the term scientific truth quite unwisely from an evolutionary standpoint. While true perception and conception of reality are clearly critical for animals, the truth is of secondary importance. The only thing that really matters is survival. In the game of life, a dead philosopher is a bad philosopher. One of the key concepts in sociobiology and in Dawkins' own early writings is the central role of deception in life. Nothing has evolved more exquisitely in the course of the biotic evolution than deception. Animals excel in deceiving rivals, mates, prey, predators, and of course themselves, so they won't inadvertently spill their own beans. And high among the extraordinary mental prowess we enjoy, thanks to our oversized brains, is our capacity for deception, self-deception, familial deception, cultural deception, and above all, spiritual deception. Our main bulwark against the certainty of death and the meaninglessness of life. Hasn't Dawkins heard of vital lies? God is surely one of the most vital lies ever conjured. Ancient people knew everything. What they lacked in hard science, they filled up 10 times over with myths. They knew exactly how the world came into being, what it's all about, and what happens to the soul at the end of time. And they were quite satisfied with that knowledge, as cattle corralled in a slaughterhouse are obliviously content. Ironically, it was modern science that gave ignorance center stage. Suddenly, I don't know became a respectable, even admirable stance. The absolute certainties of the past have turned into tiny islands of inherently uncertain knowledge in an endless sea of ignorance. How terrifying! It's hard to overstate the damage done to the human psyche by this shift from absolute certainty to absolute uncertainty. It is this loss of man's existential moorings, however physically immaterial, that give rise to the modern angst, to that sickness unto death. The paradoxical role of the truth in life is exemplified in what I call the paradox of sanity. Insane psychotic individuals are defined by their characteristic detachment from reality. A severely psychotic person may be perfectly oblivious to your presence in the room, yet stare intently at the sofa you sit on. The inability to distinguish between a human and a sofa is commonly viewed as a highly pathological breakup with reality, where in fact it is only the breakdown of our highly evolved yet physically fictitious metaphysics. Paradoxically, the psychotic's impaired perception is closer to the physical truth, which sees no qualitative difference between animate and inanimate objects. The word is placed in quotes because that concept too is strictly metaphysical than the psychiatrists. For living organisms, the ability to tell a predator from a rock or a wife from a hat is clearly advantageous, however removed from the physical reality. In the God Delusion, Dawkins plays the proverbial role of the madman, the fool, the jester, the drunkard. The boy who shouts that the emperor has no clothes, whose naked truth raises mortal fear in people's hearts by threatening to tear down their elaborate mask of sanity, a wholly justified fear. The irony in Dawkins' position stems from the fact that he scrutinizes religion not as an evolutionary biologist, the metaphysical scientist that he is, in which case he could not have possibly failed to recognize its highly adaptive merits, but as a physicist. Put in more formal terms, Dawkins subscribes to the positivistic physical verificationism instead of the metaphysical verificationism of adaptation and fitness. Why would a consummate evolutionist like Dawkins examine so human an endeavor from the standpoint of physics? The reason is historical, an irony of fate. The battle between the Church and the early modern astronomers, notably Copernicus and Galileo, over the geocentric dogma has turned into a veritable death match when Darwin challenged the biblical creation myth with his On the Origin of Species. 150 years later, and nearly a century after the Scopes trial, creationists and intelligent design advocators still pose a tangible threat to the teaching of evolution in American schools. And so the otherwise amiable evolutionists found themselves spearheading a pitched battle against the Church, while many physicists continued to peacefully practice their science as devoted Christians and spared no effort in their attempts to reduce the Church's metaphysical edifice into physical rubble. Unfortunately, Dawkins and his comrades in arms forgot along the way that their subject matter, faith, must be scientifically examined from the standpoint of the metaphysical sciences, not through the instrument of physics. Even more ironic is the fact that science has left it to the Catholic Church to be the first to realize, however tacitly, the crucial distinction between the physical reality and the metaphysical reality of life. By finally leaving physics to physicists and biology to biologists, as did Pope John Paul II in 1993 and 1996 respectively, the Church wisely withdrew its reign from the physical theatre to a metaphysical bastion no scientific revolution can hope to undermine, the kingdom of spirituality and morals. Having promulgated the supremacy of the metaphysical over the physical since its inception, it's too bad the Church has not yet mustered up the intellectual courage to proudly proclaim, at long last, that religion in general, and God in particular, have nothing to do with physical reality and strictly belong to the mental sphere alone. The ironic contradiction inherent in Dawkins' position is evident in his treatment of religious people and practices. Dawkins views religion as the root of all evil. For him, teaching religion to the young is tantamount to child abuse. Dawkins watches the rising tide of Islamic fundamentalism in the East and Christian fundamentalism in the West with a mixture of disdain and alarm, and meets with his spiritual foes on their native turf, with the Shiite zealots in East Jerusalem, with the multitudes of Catholics who flock to the miracle city Lourdes in France, and with the evangelists who he calls the American Taliban in God City, Arizona. Yet with all due respect for the real threat presented by the mounting anti-evolutionist sentiments, these countless devotees also command a different kind of respect altogether. On the one hand, we know that Dawkins is right. We know that the Blessed Virgin never rose to the heavens or made posthumous guest appearances anywhere, just as there is no question that evolution is the most substantiated, comprehensive, and productive theory in the whole of science, and that excluding it from school curricula is tantamount to an intellectual harikiri. And yet, seeing the enraptured faces of the faithful at Lourdes, listening to the evangelist congregation singing hymns to endangered values, kindness, compassion, modesty, righteousness, charity, humility, selflessness, moderation, one can't help but wonder if Dawkins doesn't miss a critical anthropological truth here. A different take on this common misconception regarding fundamentalism, that of the real Taliban this time, was inadvertently illustrated in a 2005 Time magazine article on the struggle for the soul of Islam in occupied Iraq. The article tells the story of Shakir, a westernized secular Iraqi, our kind of guy, who is deeply concerned about his son's growing attachment to Islamic fundamentalism. The son, Omar, who studies in a vocational school in the United Arab Emirates, started to lecture his father, a smoker, about Islam's disdain for tobacco and to chide his mother for wearing Western-style clothing. Worse, Omar was no longer the carefree young man he knew, the son who loved to dance and go to parties. Now, whenever the music channel was on television, Omar got out of the room. Despairingly, Shakir realizes he must do everything at his disposal to rescue Omar from the clutches of fundamentalism. Again, one cannot help wondering, rescue Omar from what? Is it really that bad that Omar wants his father to quit smoking, let alone drinking? Alcohol is strictly prohibited in Muslim countries, and prefers praying over MTV and dancing parties. As the article itself acknowledges, Islamic fundamentalism offers Omar an ordered life, a coherent worldview, a solid identity and patriotic pride, rich spirituality and an alluring afterlife, not to mention the prospect of marrying several women and, how evolutionary adaptive, fathering dozens of children. What does the secular West have to offer him? Madonna? Fear Factor? Terminator? Fast food? Pornography? Drugs and alcohol? Vain consumerism? The world's highest percentage of divorce, of deadbeat fathers and children growing up with single mothers? What does the West have to offer? Record levels of alienation, depression, anxiety and drug abuse. For Omar, all the best of the West, from democracy and freedom of speech to Puccini's operas and Einstein's relativity, just isn't as, well, fundamental. One must sympathize with both sides. For Dawkins, science has finally reached Armageddon in its valiant struggle to exorcise humanity of its ancient myths and superstitions. The spiritual world is obviously jam-packed with ludicrous fantasy and awash with fallacies. Isn't it time to finally put an end to all this flagrant hogwash? Shouldn't we let science cull ignorance and illogic from people's burgeoning noosphere, just as natural selection forces reality upon life? After all, the scientific method has proven exceptionally, almost supernaturally successful in attaining both truth and results. Why not apply it to the entire human cultural edifice? For the faithful, however, science threatens to subvert the very foundation of our metaphysics, from perception and intuition to meaning and purpose to customs and institutions. Dawkins is just the latest addition in the physicalization of the metaphysical. The marvelously animated and intuitive universe has been rendered lifeless and alien by science. Galileo turned the moon into a dead rock. Newton destroyed the rainbow's beauty. The heart became a pump. Love became molecules of dopamine and oxytocin. Freedom and dignity became contingencies of reinforcements, and human beings, according to Dawkins himself, turned into lumbering robots in the service of genes. Religions, humanities, the arts, how did Hume put it? Commit them to the flames. Science, specifically reducing the metaphysical to physics, is threatening to destroy the soul and spirit of man. The threat cannot be exaggerated. It is a stake driven right through the heart of everything that makes us human. An outrageous sacrilege, the murder of the soul. Think of love, for example, that irrational drive nowhere to be found in physics or formal logic, which also derives from the primordial imperative, live. Love is all-important to people and has been a cornerstone of many a religion. But like beauty, happiness, liberty, or any other metaphysical construct crucial to people, it is utterly and necessarily absent from the physical sciences. Why, Dawkins could have just as effectively applied his austere physicalism in another myth-busting best-selling sequel, The Love Delusion. Now, imagine two institutions. One literally founded on love and the pursuit of cosmic meaning and happiness, and another that is perfectly oblivious to them, in fact, harshly exposing the cold indifference of the cosmos and the meaninglessness of life. Which one would hold greater sway in people's hearts? The simple, dreadful truth that so far no scientist, least of all Dawkins, has dared to face is that science has utterly failed humanity with its grand promise of ultimate salvation through knowledge and rationality. Telling kids there's really no Santa Claus, as Bertrand Russell advised William James, does more than educate them about dry facts and cold reason. It also banishes essential wonder and joy from their lives and, ultimately, from their very will to live. What James intuitively felt with his pragmatism and Russell altogether missed is the overwhelming role our fictitious metaphysical fantasy plays in our life. People are terrified by physical truths that gnaw at their very life delusion. They hate to think of warmth and touch as no more than metabolic kinetics and the mutual repulsion of electrons, respectively. They are dismayed that their logic and intuitions are completely at odds with the logic of physics, from the incomprehensible quirkiness of quantum mechanics to the equally inexplicable rules of relativity. They dread the realization that they are essentially just chemical reactions or machines that operate no differently from a washing machine running its cycles. They are loath to accept that their rich and magnificent world, from the vivid perception of colours, sounds and scents, to their very conscious soul, is an illusion. And perhaps, worst of all, they relish being alive, hallowed by the divine spark that makes them qualitatively distinct from inanimate matter, and are horrified by the fact that there is no fundamental distinction between life and death, that life, like God, is not a primary aspect of physical reality, just a figment of their metaphysical fantasy. Asking rhetorically whether the first replicators were alive, Dawkins retorts in character, "Who cares?" Well, Richard, people certainly do. This fear was epitomized by Mrs. Roentgen's reaction upon seeing the first medical radiograph ever taken, her own hands. "I've seen my death." Hence the mistrust, if not downright animosity, felt by so many towards science today, even as they eagerly gorge themselves with its technological fruits and the reason for the obstinate flourishing of ancient, New Age, Far Eastern, medieval, any spirituality. People need more, much more than physical truth to lead mentally and spiritually fulfilled life. In fact, they won't be satisfied with anything short of a comprehensive spiritual system commensurate with the grand delusion that has been ingrained by the biotic evolution into their genetic, neural, and cultural DNA. Dawkins holds that the bizarreness of quantum mechanics and relativity stem from the fact that our brains have evolved in what he calls the middle world, where things are neither very large nor very small. I believe that our meter-sized scale is hardly the limiting factor in our grasp of physical reality. Animal perception has little to do with reality in and of itself, whatever that is, on any scale. We literally live a metaphysical fantasy, shared by all terrestrial organisms, which conjure self-ascribed biotic meaning out of the utterly random energy flux that makes the physical world. Our advanced scientific models are an elaborate fantasy that may correlate nicely with observation, but can't bring us any closer to grasping reality in and of itself. Plato illustrated this beautifully, even if it wasn't his intention, with his parable of the cave. The cave physicists deal only with shadows, but that doesn't prevent them from, say, accurately calculating the acceleration with which the shadow of a ball falls from the shadow of a building, even if their intricate models fit the observations perfectly. All they can ever know are mere metaphysical shadows. And what about ethics? Those adaptive rules of conduct which are the backbone of society but are utterly alien to the physical sciences. The greatest tragedy of the modern world is that in subverting the factual basis of this sacred myths, science has led to the rapid depreciation of religion, along with its adaptive morals and values, which in turn left a malignant spiritual and moral vacuum at the heart of modern society. The past century has witnessed time and time again the increasingly negative correlation between scientific progress and moral conduct, as the maladaptive application of humanity's ever more godlike technological prowess has grown ever so distant from the Hebrew prophet's vision. Standing at science's Holy of Holies, the Nobel Prize Award ceremony, Martin Luther King poignantly addresses this growing malignancy. Modern man reached new and astonishing peaks of scientific success. He has produced machines that think and instruments that peer into the unfathomable ranges of interstellar space. He has built gigantic bridges to span the seas and gargantuan buildings to kiss the skies. His aeroplanes and spaceships have dwarfed distance, placed time in chains and carved highways through the stratosphere. This is a dazzling picture of modern man's scientific and technological progress. Yet, in spite of these spectacular strides in science and technology, and still unlimited ones to come, something basic is missing. There is a sort of poverty of the spirit which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The richer we have become materially, the poorer we have become morally and spiritually. While the physical sciences that ushered this spectacular technological progress are truly without recourse when it comes to ethics, it is the metaphysical sciences, if only Dawkins was wise enough to champion his real métier, that must provide humanity with this desperately needed moral compass. Understanding Homo sapiens' evolutionary heritage and makeup lands the metaphysical sciences a critical edge and authority over traditional institutions in delineating morals for authentic human existence and the challenges of the Anthropocene, many of which no sage of old could foresee. This scientific contribution, which may ultimately save humanity and life at large on this planet, will constitute a far greater service to humankind than any theory of everything in physics. To borrow concepts from another treatise of mine, What's Wrong with the Human Operating System and How to Fix It, science and technology are by far the richest source of novel supernormal stimuli, from smartphones and virtual reality games to spacecrafts and weapons of mass destruction. This unpublished manuscript was written in the late 1980s and was originally titled Human Addiction to Supernormal Stimulation, Human Cultural Evolution as a Runaway Response to Supernormal Stimulation. Religion, on the other hand, almost universally represents age-honed morals and traditions. Looking in horror at the widespread destruction, both physical and psychological, wreaked by our runaway addiction to supernormal stimulation, one must be forgiven for clinging to beliefs and traditions that espouse simpler, harmonious living and the serenity of spiritual fulfillment. Human addiction to supernormal stimulation, to supernormal foods, drugs, sex, actions, wealth, power, fame, weapons, entertainment, ideas, etc., is the antithesis of adaptive ethics and reads like a diabolical extension to the 7 deadly sins. By contrast, the core values sanctioned by religion can still serve as an excellent template for adaptive living, like the cardinal virtues that counter the sins: chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, patience, kindness, and humility. Dawkins argues that people need not be religious to lead a virtuous life, and that the secular judicial system of the modern state has eliminated the need for divine authority and commandments. Alas, state laws have never made anyone kind, humble, or generous. People lead righteous lives because of deeply seated moral principles. Virtuous atheists and clergymen alike owe their refined conduct to the same psychological mechanisms that underlie religious convictions. The widespread ills of human addiction to supernormal stimulation go hand in hand with the malignant spiritual vacuum that has grown at the heart of modern societies. Secular judicial systems are at a loss to stem our addictions to the supernormal and their mounting toll. For the vast majority of people, the only power that can overcome this scourge is sound spirituality. Similarly, Dawkins maintains that there is no need to revert to religious experience for a sense of the sublime, for something far greater than we are, and makes a valiant attempt to show that there is much beauty, grandeur, and transcendence in science as well, and he is quite right on the latter. Science offers us the grandest of ontological mythologies, far grander than any conjured by ancient people. None of the hoary myths reaches as far back in time or as far out in space as the scientific account of creation. None so expands our horizons, our imagination, our sense of awe. Science can be uniquely inspirational, non-pareil, in its eureka moments, more beautiful than any art and as moving as any spiritual experience. And science is unrivaled as the sole mythology, true to the best of our logic and knowledge. But woefully constrained by logic and physical facts, science can never compete with the richness of the broader metaphysical realm that defines us. And why should it? How can it compel us to give up the full range of human experience? As sublime as the beauty of the Hubble images and the thrill of discovery are, why deny the validity of all human expression, from music and the visual arts to sport and games to poetry and fiction, and of that distinct form of transcendence, religious spirituality? Considering all this, it must take spectacular superciliousness to ascribe the spiritual experience of billions to sheer idiocy and ignorance, and an equal measure of naivete to trumpet God's physical non-existence as a Columbus discovering America or Darwin discovering evolution. Instead of abolishing God with the glee of a 4-year-old who enjoys stunning dinner guests with profanities, Dawkins should have contemplated harder why most of humanity still clings to fairy tales consciously and tenaciously, despite 3 centuries of intellectual enlightenment and the obvious facts about God's glaring absenteeism. Does he really see something that the vast majority fails to see? Or is Dawkins, his formidable intellect notwithstanding, curiously blind to what most people sense intuitively, the central significance of the metaphysical in life? This primacy of the soul over matter was pithily articulated by Mark. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? Mark 8:36. And more elaborately in a 1738 verse from Meselat Yesharim, literally the way of the righteous, by Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. translated from the Hebrew. Think of a commoner who married a princess. If he brought her all the material goods in the world, they'd mean nothing to her. Why? For she's the king's daughter. And so is the soul. If you brought her all the material goods in the world, they would mean nothing to her. Why? For she's God's daughter. Dawkins has particular difficulty understanding religious scientists. How can researchers educated in scientific epistemology and knowledge believe in the existence of an unobservable presence? Why don't they apply their analytical tools to myths and rituals? After all, no religious scientist in his right mind would base his findings on ancient texts, revelation, or prayer. The obvious answer is that these scientists were raised in two coexisting yet utterly incompatible cultures. One that taught them about God, the Holy Ghost and archangels, the other about critical thinking and empirical validation. Like dual citizens of warring nations, these epistemic chimeras simply learned to safely compartmentalize conflicting teachings into mutually exclusive magisteria. But for most religious scientists, there is a more fundamental reason. They know that whether the Earth is flat or space-time curved has hardly any bearing on people's raison d'être, and are the first to acknowledge that while the scientific method has easily conquered humanity's corporeal body, thanks to its phenomenal success in the physical realm, it inevitably remains alien to its soul. So, despite the obvious fallaciousness of religious beliefs, these scientists uphold their preeminence, for this is the quintessence of man. Ecclesiastes 12:13. This is not a leap of faith a la Tertullian's Credo Quia Absurdum, but a far more perspicacious observation of the human condition. Faith is deeply entrenched in the human psyche, be it in the belief in God Almighty or in atheism or physicalism. It is hardwired into our genetic makeup. It matters not whether one worships in cathedrals or TEV colliders, whether one seeks salvation in heaven, in artistic or literary projects, in finding a cure for cancer, in reaching nirvana, or singularity. The conflict between science and religion has proven so intractable precisely because it's a clash of opposing belief systems that ultimately stand on the same ontological footing. The breakdown of this ingrained instinct for both parties invariably brings demise and despair. Dawkins should know how hard it is to extirpate faith etched into a man's heart. He himself, the high priest of atheistic fundamentalism, is a fine specimen of sapiens religioso. The irony is clearly lost on the cohorts of starstruck, rational zealots that follow him. Even the religious myths, those angels dancing on the point of a needle, do not seem quite so absurd anymore. Haldane was right. The universe, as it turns out, is even queerer than we can suppose. Ever since Einstein liberated physicists' imagination, theories have grown increasingly bizarre and untestable. They don't even rise to the level of being wrong, derided Pauli. And on the empirical front, the latest data strongly imply the existence of highly elusive, dark facets of reality. Now, having discovered hints of barely observable reality, isn't it more sensible and parsimonious to conclude that there must also exist perfectly unobservable reality, forever undetectable forms of matter, forces or other altogether unimaginable entities, even demons and spirits, that may nevertheless interact with us, like the hypothesized extra-spatial dimensions and adjacent universes? Modern science has come a full circle in less than 4 centuries since the birth of the scientific method. Today we can categorically ascertain that we live in a reality that ultimately lays beyond our capacity to either examine or comprehend. Suddenly the age-old wisdom of humility, that profound insight into the inherent limitations of the human intellect, which is at the base of the humble submission of the faithful, appears downright prophetic. Moreover, Since the human psyche is an emergent phenomenon that is irreducible to first principles, but like the subjective experience of qualia, is nonetheless a primary reality in our universe, its existence being the only fact of which we can be certain, as Descartes observed, arguably even more so than the existence of the material world, it is hardly incongruous to posit a universal mind or cosmic intelligence, a latter-day scientist's God, not to be confused with the intelligent designer of biblical creation, of which human sentience is but a distant echo. Just as our corporeal bodies are part of the physical universe, so are our souls with respect to the great spirit in the sky. The glaring, ignominious fact that modern science doesn't even know where to begin its quest to fathom consciousness only serves to further bolster the case for non-physical spirit. This is why many religions are panentheistic, maintaining that God's and the universe's physical immanence is mere shadows on the cave walls and that his true essence is perfectly spiritual. Some physicists have gone so far as to maintain that consciousness is primary to matter, that nothing, not even the sun and the moon, exists outside our minds, or that matter, at its most fundamental, is not made of matter at all, but the incorporeal substance which poses as matter to us on a much larger scale may well be spiritual in essence, reminiscent of the word that gave rise to creation and its modern equivalents. It from bit, it from info, it from math, it from qubit. It's hardly surprising that the panentheistic universe and the mathematical universe are conceptually quite similar. Both rest on the same Platonic plinth and share the same intuitive, aesthetic and transcendental appeal. In his dialectical turn, the physicalist could rightly retort that since minds, souls and consciousness are never observed independently of physical brains, and since the complexity of subjective experience appears to correlate with the physical complexity of the experiencing brain, one could safely assume that a universal mind would necessitate a brain-like structure, cosmically more complex than the human brain, something that is conspicuously absent in the observable universe of galaxies, suns and planets, of mostly ultra-hot and ultra-cold particles and the various forces that give them motion. So even if our mind stuff seems intangible, boundless and free from the shackles of physics, one can instantly and effortlessly smash galaxy clusters together against each other in one's imagination. It's plainly unwarranted to assume that the physical universe somehow hides or gives rise to global spirituality. I believe that both attempts to project human metaphysics unto physical reality, whatever that is, are mistaken, and that everything from our basic precepts to our sense of the transcendental belongs solely to the rich metaphysics of our minds. We may fail to find any trace of other civilizations in the cosmos, just as Dawkins has failed to find God, not because superior intelligence is ultimately inimical to life, but due to a critical factor that Frank Drake left out of his equation. While we may share chemistry and biology with countless alien life forms, our highly evolved mental sphere may well prove far more idiosyncratic. No other civilization within observable distance appears to share our metaphysical space. Conventional wisdom sees the progress of modern Weltanschauung as a sobering journey whereby man gradually lost his central, all-important position in the cosmos. Copernicus banished us forever from the center of the universe. Darwin relegated us to the outskirts of the biosphere, altogether reducing humanity to an utterly insignificant accident on an infinitesimal dust speck floating in an endless and unfathomable multiverse. I restore man's place right back at the center of the universe. Not the center of the physical universe, of course, but the center of a metaphysical universe, which is his and his alone. A perfectly fictitious universe, to be sure, but one that is our very heart and soul and is beautiful and wonderful and amazing and exciting, far more than, to use Whitehead's depiction, the dull affair, soundless, scentless, colourless, merely the hurrying of material endlessly, meaninglessly, of the physical realm. Where physicalism, from the British empiricists to the logical positivists, of whom Dawkins is an eager disciple, proclaim that all metaphysics is meaningless, in homage to the contrast between the young and old Wittgenstein, I say that it is the physical sciences which must keep silent about all metaphysical matters. Unwittingly, Dawkins commits the same category mistake perpetrated by the religious Platonism he is so fond of disparaging. For the faithful, spiritual idealism constitutes the ultimate reality. Its physical manifestations are all but insignificant. Dawkins represents the swinging of the pendulum in scientific culture to the exact opposite, towards absolute denial of spiritual idealism. Both fail to appreciate the critical distinction between the physical reality and the metaphysical reality of life, and the vital significance of both in human affairs. The realization that we live in two realms, the physical and the metaphysical, each a vast universe unto itself with distinct laws and validation criteria, is the key to complete and mutually respectful bridging between science and religion. No more two opposing cultures or the forced compartmentalization between knowledge and belief. Seeing is believing and believing is seeing. But two authentic aspects of the human condition. The various branches of science must reflect this insight. The reductionism to physics has proven extremely productive in the study of the physical realm, but totally and miserably misses the mark when applied to the metaphysical realm. In the life and human sciences, the validity and meaning of biological and mental constructs lies not in physics, but entirely within the emergent and self-defining metaphysical realm. Those who wish to deny the metaphysical, to wake out of the millenary dream as Jacques Monod aspired, would discover at their peril that it's the heart and soul of humanity, that to deny it is to deny our very selves. The faithful, on the other hand, should no longer take offense at God's physical immaterialness, but rather take pride in the fact that it is the metaphysical reality, as fictitious and physically fallacious as it is, that is indeed the more significant reality to us. It's the culmination of the conceptual progression from the concrete graven images of pagans through the abstract but very real, omnipotent, omniscient and omnipresent God of Moses and Newton, to an abstract and immaterial, strictly metaphysical God that exists, along with nearly everything else that matters to us only in our heads. In that reality, God will forever reign as the perfect, absolute and everlasting transcendence.